Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and loads of love to each and every one of you. I do hope you're doing incredibly well. I'm doing great. And before we get started, don't forget to get your special drink. I get all kinds of information about what you love to drink. I gather some of you love red wine, and I have a listener who enjoys a cup of hot Irish coffee. So whatever it is that you particularly enjoy drinking, don't forget to let me know about it, because I'm fascinated. But before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is James Rotherfield, and I'm from North America, where I grew up in an idyllic farm very close to a charming rural town. I don't wish to give you my geographic location for the very purposes of remaining anonymous, most especially because I know they're benevolent, gentle Bigfoot still living in the wooded area of my property that deserve to live out their lives in peace. I grew up in the 70s, and I was so fortunate to be raised on a farm surrounded by the natural wonders of nature. Our enchanting, sizable 1800s farmhouse had been in the Rotherfield family for generations and was to be passed down to the eldest son in the family line by way of inheritance. I would invariably end up ploughing the land on our family farm, much like my father had done and my grandfather before him, where we grew a very successful corn and wheat crop. I must admit our prepossessing historical farmhouse, where I still live today, was quite literally the ideal place to raise kids, as the house itself had so many exciting nooks and crannies for children to discover. It was airy and spacious, with spectacular views over the verdant countryside. I had two sisters, both younger than myself, and their feminine influence on my life was a huge positive. It helped me to develop the more sensitive side to my character. As kids, we pretty much did everything together as a rather formidable, forceful team. We climbed trees, rode our bicycles, including my parents' horses that were stabled on our farm, and last but not least, we spent copious amounts of time in the wood green. It would seem that we were always drawn to this magnetic, shaded retreat that was so spectacularly beautiful. It's difficult to explain to you how beguiling this place was, but I assure you, if you had seen it for yourself, you would have understood the alluring attraction. My mother once told me that an ancestor on our father's side of our family was an artist, and he spent every day of his life in the wood green because it was so magnetically arresting, and all he ever did was just paint the trees, and his work was outstanding. If the trees were spectacular in his lifetime, imagine what they were like when I was young. On our farm we had some ancient redwood trees, oaks, walnuts and maples, and they were quite literally giants that were hundreds of years old. And these imposing, regal-looking skyscrapers towered up into the sky with such a graceful repose, providing a magnificent shaded canopy that was a haven for all kinds of indigenous and intriguing wildlife on our land. And we had everything from whitetails to raccoons, rabbits, squirrels, bobcats and coyotes. There was also a very beguiling stream that zigzagged through the wood grove, and a magnificent waterfall that thundered over a rocky outcrop with a resplendent display of white foaming water that jetted over the rocks with a forceful, invigorating current. I do remember we adored paddling over the pebbles in the shallow part of the stream, as the moving water, along with the pebbles beneath our feet, act as a massage. One day my sisters and I were playing hide-and-seek in the woods, where our eyes were suddenly drawn to two peculiar, rather lumpy forms lying under a large oak tree, that at first we thought were bags of potatoes. Imagine our shock when we discovered that the bags of potatoes were bodies of two deceased men that looked like they'd been flogged within an inch of their lives before they had finally met their deadly fate, which looked ominously like a single shot to the head. There were long vertical lash marks all over their naked torsos, where their skin had been torn and shredded apart, almost ripped if you like. As kids, it was alarming and disturbing for us to behold this horrendous, despicable sight, as this was the first time we'd ever seen a deceased human body before, and in this case there were two of them. The two corpses looked like white mannequins that had been thickly layered in stage paint to intensify the graphic visual effects of the deep bruising that was in bright purples and blues and yellows. It was indisputable to all three of us that these bodies were not stage props at all, for we discerned that they were definitely real. Even the eyes of the bodies were blackened by bruises and almost half shut from the swelling where they had conspicuously been punched very brutally. Both corpses were missing digits from their fingers and toes on their feet, which was in itself peculiarly odd. As kids, we were very alarmed and startled by what we were beholding, but also fascinated at the same time. We quickly ran home to tell our parents what we had discovered. But when we returned to the wood green with both of our parents, the bodies had mysteriously just vanished. I could see my mother giving my father that exasperated, knowing look, as she rolled her eyes at the back of her head, which implied that she believed we were making up fictitious stories just to get attention. "But the bodies were here a moment ago," I assured them. "We saw them for ourselves. I promise you, they were real." "Well, where are they, son?" asked my father. "Kids," he said, "it's not funny to make up serious stories like this. Have you ever heard the story of the boy that cried wolf too many times?" he asked us. "No," we all said at once. "Well," said my father, "one day there was a boy who loved making up all kinds of stories just for fun. He told his father, who was a farmer, that a wolf was attacking his precious sheep, and the alarmed farmer, who loved his sheep, quickly ran to the pasture to see that the sheep were happily grazing away. And the kid just laughed. "I was only joking," he said. Over and over again he told his father that the wolf was attacking the sheep, and again the farmer would check on the sheep to find that they were absolutely fine. The boy would laugh and say, "I was only joking." One day it rarely happened, and the child said, "Dad, I'm not joking. This time there is a wolf attacking the sheep." But the father did absolutely nothing, because he believed his kid was making it all up, as every time he checked on the sheep, it had always been a joke. Why should it be any different this time, he thought to himself. So he ignored his son. The next day, to his absolute horror, he found 12 of his sheep all dead. They had been savagely killed by the wolf that the boy had seen, who might have been spared if only the farmer had believed his son's story. "But, Daddy, we weren't lying. There really were 2 dead bodies here. I promise you," I insisted. "If you say so, son," said my father, looking at me with a very sceptical, dubious look on his face, which said it all. He didn't believe me. One day my sisters and I were in the woods together when we heard men's voices, and immediately we went to hide behind a large redwood tree, as we were afraid. We knew our wood green could be accessed close to the open dirt road on one side of the valley, so it wasn't unheard of for people to venture in on our property, although of course it was rare, as it was private land. Imagine our immense shock when 2 men, their heads covered in black material bags, were thrown and pushed to their knees onto the earthen ground by this very aggressive, cold-blooded man who looked as savage as a pit bull terrier, along with his 2 unsavoury accomplices, all whom were rough, thuggish Philistines. They wore their sleek black hair gelled up in a rather punk rock style, and each of them had an expensive, thick gold chain around their necks, with white vests to show off their sizable biceps, for they were built very well. When they pulled the black bags off their victims' heads, whose arms and legs were shackled by thick rope, I could see that these poor hollow-cheeked men had also been very badly beaten up. The eyes were almost closed up by the swelling and extensive bruising that they had incurred. Sadly, I noticed that both of these men were missing the digits from their hands, which I imagine was part of this inhumane punishment that they had obviously endured at the hands of these indecent, treacherous, uncultured yobs. The haggard, gaunt captives looked so dishevelled and weary, worn out and dog-tired from the uncouth persecution that they had endured, which I estimate must have been several days of horrendous sadistic torture. They seemed almost resigned to their plight, as if they'd sensed that there was no way of escape for them, and they were like lambs to the slaughter that put up very little resistance. The pugnacious gang leader snarled like a fractious dog, as both men whose eyes were fixed to the ground as they kneeled. He spat on the ground in disgust. "Did I not tell you? Anyone who betrays my trust is dead." He began to kick the pasty-faced man with his heavy boots. "Sir, I can still get you the money," said the one peaky man, trembling in terror. "Please give me a chance. I have children and a wife that need me." "You should have thought about that before you messed around with the likes of me and failed to deliver on your promises." "What use will I be to you dead?" piped the man. "If I'm alive, at the very least I can try and find Mr. Brenner for you, and then you'll get your money back." "You're going to find Mr. Brenner, are you? Who absconded with 50 kilos of my finest cocaine? You're going to find him, are you? In your dreams, you'll never find him." "Yes, I will. Just give me another chance." "That's what you said 3 weeks ago. Over and over again you promised. But time's up, buddy. If you don't collect the payment, you pay with your life. You know the rules. There's no special treatment on my watch for anyone." "What about you, Tim? What have you to say for yourself?" said the gangster, turning to the other man, who was as quiet as a church mouse. "Go ahead and shoot me, sir," said the man. "I can't take the savagery any more. You've literally sucked the life out of my soul. I've nothing to say. Get on with it." At that, the ruthless gangster then pulled his rifle out and shot the men at point-blank range, and they fell to the ground instantly, their lives extinguished in a single blow. It almost looked too easy. We watched in absolute horror as, along with his 2 boorish accomplices, the gangster retreated through the wood, and I could hear a car engine in the distance revving up as it drove off into the distance. My sisters and I were absolutely appalled by the callous atrocity of what we had just witnessed. This was the sort of brutish, oafish behaviour that happened in the movies, but not in 1970s America. Surely not. We remained hidden because we suddenly sensed something or someone was coming, and we falsely perceived that maybe the horrible villainous thugs were coming back. "Keep still," I warned my sisters. "Someone's coming." All of a sudden we saw a dark, shadowy silhouette moving through the curtain of shrubbery, and I seriously thought I was hallucinating or even seeing things, for never in my entire life have I beheld such a peculiar, anomalous critter. It could have been described as human, but that would have been not altogether correct, for although human, the critter possessed very striking ape-like characteristics. "What is that?" whispered my sister, looking at me in horror. "It's so big! It's so scary looking." Without doubt, the critter was Herculean in size, towering at about 8 foot tall, 700 pounds, and 3 foot wide across the shoulders, with very long arms that tapered beyond the knees, with pronounced distinguished biceps and shoulders, and, of course, powerful, strong, tree-trunk-sized legs. The creature was covered in thick tufts of dark brown hair that seemed less dense over the torso area and under the armpits and knees. It possessed a pyramid-shaped head that sat on its shoulders rather like a boiled egg on a cup, without any evidence of a neck, for if there was one, it was concealed by an abundance of hair. The critter possessed a very distinguished human face, a furrowed, sloping forehead, a rather flat, widened nose, and deep-set, dark eyes. The critter moved over towards the dead corpses, and appeared to be astonished and confounded by what he'd discovered. We watched the solicitous creature using its large human-like feet to poke the bodies, as if looking for any signs of life, But of course there were none, for the bodies remained completely lifeless. The critter stood up, proud, erect and tall, rather reminding me of a tree trunk. He scratched his head in deep contemplation, making a strange chattering sound under his breath. I could sense he was deeply troubled and rather dismayed to see 2 dead bodies. We watched him drag the corpses by their legs towards a large tree trunk, and he proceeded to dig up the ground, that appeared surprisingly soft already, which was an antithesis to the rest of the wood green, where the ground was solid and unyielding. "I think he's digging a grave," I said to my sisters. "Why would he do that?" my sister asked me. "I think he may feel sorry for the men," I suggested. "Perhaps he thinks they deserve a burial. Otherwise, left in the open, they'll be eaten by the coyotes, mountain lions or bobcats. Maybe he's doing for them what he would do for his own kind." "Why should he care?" said my sister. "Perhaps because he's more human and compassionate than the thug who murdered these men in cold blood." We watched in amazement as the critter dug with the assistance of a stone a very sizable large hole in the ground, and then he rolled both bodies into the ground, covering them both with soil. He stood there for a while, surveying the scene, and once again scratching his head very thoughtfully, as though he was lost deep in thought, for he appeared intelligent and discerning. I couldn't help wondering if he'd also buried the 2 bodies that we had discovered before. Was it possible that they had been buried in exactly the same spot in the ground? For the soil, as I told you, was soft and yielding, unlike the rest of the wood green. Why was this odorous gangster, whoever on earth he was, using our wood grove as a dumping ground for all his victims? It defied rational explanation. Why did he not even bother to hide the evidence of his iniquitous crime, I wondered. Of course, when we told our parents what had happened in the wood green, it didn't go down very well at all, as you can imagine, and they didn't even pretend to believe me. We were having dinner, and I piped, "Guess what, Mum? We saw 2 men being shot dead in the woods today, and a great big hairy ape buried their bodies." My mother rolled her eyes at the back of her head and looked at my father for support. "Son," my father said, "what did I tell you about crying wolf? Haven't you learnt a lesson from my story?" "But it's true," I protested. "Why won't you believe me?" "Eat your dinner, James," my mother snapped, "and only open your mouth when you have something civilized and rational to say, something realistic and real, not in your head. I don't think any of those mystery books of yours you're reading are doing you any good whatsoever. They appear to be wreaking havoc on your imagination. I don't appreciate you making up such horrific, frightful tales. Personally, I'd like to get a good night's sleep, and I don't need my head filled up with all these twisted nightmare scenarios you're making up." "Tell them," I said to my sister, "tell them what we saw in the woods." My sisters remained quiet and very uncooperative, failing to come to my defence, which absolutely infuriated me. It was clear they did not want our parents to tarnish their characters by accusing them of being crazy, like obviously I was, and so they very wisely said nothing. "See," said my mother, "if there was any truth to your spurious allegations, don't you think your sisters would come to your defence? And I see that they haven't. They're afraid to say anything, Mum, because you never believe a word any of us say," I piped. "Off to bed with you now, James," snapped my mother. "I've had quite enough." While we enjoyed spending so much time in the wood green, after the horrifying incident that we had witnessed, we always had one wary eye open in the back of our heads, as we were rather afraid that the nauseating villain would come back. But luckily we never saw him again. And if he did come back to drop off some lifeless, unwanted cargo, we were very fortunate not to be around at the time. One day the sheriff pulled up at our drive, and I could see him in deep conversation with both of my parents, and the expressions on their faces looked deadly serious and very aggrieved. I could only imagine what they were talking about. I was to learn that he had informed my parents that the police were going to be searching the wood green on our land for any sign of dead bodies, as a police informer had told them that some bodies were likely to be found on our premises. "Are you sure, Sheriff?" asked my father. "Are you saying they're dead corpses on my land?" "I'm afraid so," said the sheriff. "For some reason, the corrupt drug lord that runs a sizable drug cartel dropped the bodies off of all his victims on your premises, adjacent to the dirt road, which gave him very easy access to the woods on your land. I think he felt very certain and secure that he wouldn't be seen, as it's exceedingly remote out here. I do gather his grandmother lives in this part of the world, so he knows it well. He loves visiting his grandmother while disposing of his unwanted cargo. He is crooked, contemptible, the type that needs to be placed behind bars, and the sooner the better as far as I'm concerned. We've had our eyes on his coming and goings of the cartel for over 5 long years now. Unfortunately, more and more evidence has come to light and is piling up against him. And we've had a few whistleblowers, but we need tangible evidence, so finding the bones of these victims is crucial to making a strong case against him in a court of law. Do you know that if anybody betrayed his trust or double-crossed him or was unable to collect his funds from the drugs, he would chop off their fingers and punch them brutally in the eyes and beat them with a leather thong until the flesh came apart, leaving them to suffer for many days until he chose to finally kill them? I gather he is big on the punishing lark and in making his victims suffer excruciating pain before he finally kills them, as an example and warning to the other members of his cartel, and a stark reminder of what will happen to them if they should betray his trust. Do you know he actually sends the fingers of his villains to other members of the cartel in the post, just to warn them that if they don't toe the line, this could be them next?" "How awful," said my mother. "He sounds like a real scumbag. Does this sort of barbaric stuff rarely go on in this day and age? Surely not." "I'm afraid so, ma'am," said the sheriff. "There's a lot of evil under the sun, and just because you don't see it does not mean it's not going on. You should read Ecclesiasticals, ma'am. As for King Solomon wisely stipulated, there is nothing new under the sun. What has been before will be again." "Well, why would this drug lord bury the bodies on our land of all things? It seems nonsensical and outlandish," piped my father. "I told you," said the sheriff. "He knows this area exceedingly well, thanks to his grandmother. The informer does not believe he buried the bodies. He thinks the bodies were killed on your land and then abandoned, or dead bodies were offloaded here for the wild animals to eliminate all the evidence." "That's high risk," said my father. "I'm surprised I haven't stumbled across any bones yet, or some clothes or shoes lying around." "That's because they're buried," I piped. "I saw someone burying a couple of the dead men myself. Remember I told you, Mum, but you didn't believe me." My mother flushed with embarrassment. "I'm sorry, Sheriff," she said, looking ever so awkward. "James is rather inclined to be very imaginative. He's got a lovely imagination, so I didn't believe him. But he must have been telling the truth after all." "It's perfectly understandable, man," said the sheriff. "Do you mind if I borrow James to show me where he saw the 2 bodies being buried, so that we can get the crime team to dig it all up?" My father looked ashen. He was not taking all this very well. "Sheriff," he asked, looking exceedingly unsettled and discomposed, "how many dead corpses do you expect to find on my land?" "We're not certain," said the sheriff, looking rather uncomfortable. "Maybe a couple of dozen." "A couple of dozen?" my father gasped. "A couple of dozen dead bodies on my land?" he said, looking very appalled. "That's horrendous, Sheriff. This is an awful nightmare." "Don't blame yourself for any of this, sir. I assure you, These things happen. And so it was our wooded area was surrounded and teeming with tons of police vehicles, dozens of men, and crime scene tape everywhere. For 3 children, it was incredibly exciting. The men began to dig up the grave, and 24 bodies were recovered from the site. And although the deceased victims, according to the sheriff, were not men of good character, it wasn't really a surprise to any of us, as what kind of person would actually work for an evil drug lord? We could see the plastic-covered dead corpses being placed into the back of a coroner's van. Later that morning, the sheriff brought a young policeman to our door, who was shaking like a leaf and looked scared out of his skin. "May I trouble you for some sweet tea, ma'am?" said the sheriff. "One of our men has rather had a dreadful shock. I think seeing all the deceased bodies has unsettled him greatly. He's new to the force, and the truth is, ma'am, one never gets over the atrocities one sees." "Of course," said my mother, ushering the policeman into our kitchen and putting her hand against his forehead. "You are heating up quite badly," she said to him. "I think you have a soaring temperature." In my mother's younger days, she had been a nurse, so she knew exactly how to help the speechless man, whom appeared to be staring into space with a bemused, vacant, disorientated expression on his face. He clearly looked as if he'd had quite some shock. My mother made some sweet tea, in which she added a couple of shots of brandy, and handed it to the man, who began to wobble like a jelly. "I was a nurse for many long years," my mother assured him kindly. "I worked around dying people, and it wasn't easy. When I first started nursing, I could barely stomach seeing a dead person. But after a while, it became an intrinsic part of my job. I gradually learnt to accept what was inevitable. You'll soon see in time you'll be able to learn to deal with the dead. It's not really that bad." The wilted man looked at my mother with eyes the size of saucers. "It's not the dead bodies I'm scared of, ma'am. It's the monster in your woods." I knew exactly what he was talking about. He had clearly seen the critter in the woods that we'd seen. His reaction to the beast was, in my opinion, way over the top. For although big and intimidating, it had not struck me as vindictive. For indeed the critter had shown compassion for all those dead bodies he'd buried. But appearances can be very deceptive, at the very best of times. "Monster?" my mother asked the man. "Sorry, what are you talking about?" "Can I have some more brandy, ma'am?" said the man. "It helps me to think straight. It stabilises my nerves somehow." "Of course," said my mother, pouring him a couple more shots of brandy. "But don't overdo it," she teased. "The sheriff won't forgive me if you leave our premises in an intoxicated state." I watched the man calm down, as the brandy seemed to relax him and work wonders, because he began to talk. "Those dead bodies, ma'am, they weren't a pretty sight, I admit to that. But I do have a stomach of steel, and can handle most things, I assure you, even though I'm relatively new to the force, but dead bodies have never bothered me at all. I only had a scare when I decided to take a break from digging and went off to relieve myself behind a large redwood tree. All of a sudden I got this disturbing feeling that I wasn't alone, and that I was being watched and studied. I could feel chills going down my spine. I can't believe how frightened I felt. My heart began to race. Instinctively I sensed something was very off, and that was when I saw him. He was gargantuan. He was standing yards away from me, just staring at me. He didn't stop staring. I don't think I've ever felt so much fear in my life. I was terrified. I didn't even know how to react to this thing. Did I walk away, or did I run for my life? This critter possessed the presence of an apex predator, like a lion or a tiger or a bear, and I sensed danger in every fibre of my being. I can't tell you how colossal this thing was, because it was monstrously big. It looked like a man covered in hair, but a giant man, and it definitely wasn't totally human. It had those long arms of an ape, and the typical cone-shaped head you sometimes see in the ape species. But otherwise, It was remarkably human. "What did you do?" asked my mother. "I just walked away. It didn't chase me or anything, and when I tried to tell everybody what I'd seen, the words didn't come out, and everybody thought I was having a panic attack because of how gruesome the dead bodies appeared, with the fingers chopped off and so forth. I don't think the critter would hurt you," I told the man, interceding. "I think he just looks scary. But he does have a good heart. He's intelligent." "You've seen the monster?" asked my mother, looking more than a little startled. "When, James? When did you see him? Why didn't you tell me about this?" "I did tell you. Remember, I told you about the ape man I saw in the woods." My mother once again looked very embarrassed. "Sorry, dear. Your story sounded so far-fetched. It was impossible to believe." "That's my problem," said the man. "Who on earth is ever going to believe my story that I've shared with you? Mind you keep it to yourself, or I'll be the laughing stock of the force, and I'll lose my job and be relegated to the nut house, and I can't have that. So you better keep your mouth shut. I'm glad to inform you that the police successfully brought down that drug cartel, and they arrested the drug lord, and from what I gather he was sentenced to death, and I cannot say I lost any sleep over his fate, for he was a wicked, duplicitous man who deserved a harsh sentence. This all happened about 40 years ago, and I remember all this detail, graphically, as if it happened yesterday. I soon began to learn that the critter my sisters and I encountered was what we know as a Bigfoot. When I eventually inherited the farm from my father, I allowed my own children to have free rein on our property and play along in the wood green, much like I had done before them. Suffice to say, all three of my children encountered Bigfoot on several occasions, and the interactions were always benevolent. I hasten to say that instead of being remotely afraid, my children were very excited and enthralled by their curious encounter. They said the critter that they had seen was exceedingly kind. I asked my daughter why she thought the Bigfoot was kind, and this is what she said. "Daddy, you can always tell when someone's nice. All you have to do is look at their eyes. The Bigfoot looked like he cared. He was friendly, and I think if we were in any kind of trouble, he would have helped us." At this, my other children fiercely agreed. "Daddy," they said, "we feel as if he's watching over us, as if he's protecting us in some way." The only horrifying event we had on our farm happened when my wife and I saw two men running in the wood green late at night. It terrified her to think that someone was loose on our property. She called me, and armed with my rifle, we followed the men into the woods. It was the weirdest experience of my entire life, as one minute they were there, and then they were gone. But my wife and I saw them very clearly, every single detail. I can't be sure if we saw two ghosts or not, but I have absolutely no explanation as to why these men vanished so suddenly before our very eyes. It has left me to conclude that maybe the spirits of the two men I saw shot on our land are loitering around the place. It's not impossible. I do know on occasions we have seen light orbs in our forest, which some believe are the souls of the departed, but I'm not courageous enough to go investigating, as I'm afraid of what I might actually see. So there you are. That's my story. What an extraordinary story, and how glad I am that that drug cartel was brought down, because they caused so much damage to so many people's lives. Anyway, if you enjoyed the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Until next time, goodbye and good night.